All right, hey team, here we go, another phylum, Phylum Annelida. Let's rock and roll. So Phylum Annelida, these are the segmented worms, all right? So we're still in superphylum Lophotrochozoa. So these have a trochophore larvae, and that's why they're part of Phylum Annelida. So that name, little rings, Annelida, that's what that means, little rings. And they look like little rings that are stacked on top of each other. And we call that segmentation. We call that metamerism, all right? So that's the technical term for segmentation. But these are segmented worms that are typically going to be found in freshwater, marine, or damp terrestrial habitats. They are very common. We're not quite sure about their phylogenetic relationship, how they're generally related to each other, but they're very diverse in both the morphologies that we see, as well as the life cycles, the lifestyles, life cycles, the environments in which they live, how they eat. They're very diverse, and it's been challenging for us to kind of figure out how they're related to each other. But they tend to have a few things in common. Not only are they all mostly segmented, they also have Parapodia, which may or may not bear chetae, or sometimes also pronounced chetae, made of chitin. All right, so we'll look at that, what those look like in just a second. So these are going to be triploblastic. These are true coelomates. They're going to move through a hydrostatic skeleton. Okay, so they're going to move through a hydrostatic skeleton. We'll watch what that looks like in a second. So they're very diverse, everything from a leech to an earthworm to these marine bristleworms to this feather duster, all right, to these tube worms. They're very, very different in all of the different lifestyles that they have. And there's about 22,000 species overall that we know of. There may be more than that. We're not quite sure. So these Parapodia, so para means next to, so these are next to feet. These are the fleshy lobes, so these fleshy extensions that we see coming out of this microscope. So this is a microscopic image, a micrograph of a parapodium. So these fleshy lobes, these are the Parapodia themselves. And then these bristles that are coming out, these bristles, those are made of chitin, and they're used as appendages for movements. They can use them to kind of, as they're extending and contracting their hydrostatic skeleton, they can use those bristles, those chetae, as leverage to move against whatever medium they're moving through. So these Parapodia are often adapted for respiration. So they can take on the function of gills in a lot of marine or freshwater annelids. So these Parapodia may or may not bear chetae. It just depends on the ecology of the organism, its evolutionary history, and typically where it's going to be living, right? What type of medium it's moving through. So these terms, Sedentarians and Errantians, these are not true classification terms. These are just ways that we kind of categorize these organisms. So this is not a true phylogenetic relationship. These aren't classes, these aren't suborders, these aren't subphyla. This is just a general way that we kind of classify these organisms. So the Sedentarians, that name means sedentary, right? Like to sit. These tend to be less mobile than the Errantians. Sedentarians would also include not only this Christmas tree worm, like we see here with this really highly modified mouth structure. This is its mouth basically, and then the rest of the worm is in a tube underneath here. But this group of Sedentarians also would include the earthworms, as well as the leeches. Okay, the Sedentarians are typically going to have, especially the ones that are truly sedentary, like these Christmas tree worms or these tube worms, they're going to have elaborate gills that are used for filter feeding. Okay, but not all of this group are truly sedentary. So this is kind of a wonky classification, or a wonky way to break them up, because Sedentarians also include the leeches and the earthworms. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if next time I make this video, maybe next year or next semester, that this type of grouping is no longer valid. And then the other group, the Errantians, these ones over here, so like to run an errand means to be moving, right? So that's where it gets its name. Typically, most members of the Errantian group are going to be mobile marine predators or grazers. So they're going to have typically extensive parapodia used for gills, okay, for gas exchange, and then all these bristles coming off of here, all those bristles, those chetae, made out of chitin. However, the parapodia and the bristles are not unique to that group, though, the Errantians. We see them also in the Sedentarians. Okay. So the earthworms, so we've all seen these as they come up to the surface when it rains out of the soil. So these are terrestrial annelids. These would be part of the Sedentarians, but they're not sedentary, right? So this is why it's a weird grouping. These are more classically known as part of the oligochaetes, which means few chetae, basically. But these earthworms are typically going to be terrestrial. They're going to be consuming soil, both inorganic and organic materials, and then breaking that down. So they're really important. They help to aerate the soil, and they help to release nutrients back into that soil. And when they break down that organic material, usually leaf litter or something like that, they're breaking it down in such a way that makes it easier for other plants, to reabsorb the material, those nutrients. So some studies have shown that earthworm casts, which is what we call their feces, earthworm poop basically is called a cast. They're about 5 times richer, these casts, in available nitrogen, and about 7 times richer in available phosphate compared to the soil around them, and 11 times richer in potassium, right, compared to the upper 6 inches of soil, which is really for most ecosystems, that's going to be the active area of the soil, the 6 inches. Okay, so they're incredibly important in returning these nutrients into the environment. Okay, so again, these are going to be moving by a hydrostatic skeleton. Okay, so we have some slides that are going to be looking at in lab for this earthworm, the lumbricus. So you can see it's going to extend out part of its body and then contract it, and then extend out and contract. And those waves of contractions are driven by muscles contracting and expanding part of that hydroskeleton. Okay, and so there's a close-up view of their chetae or their chetae, either is fine. Those bristles that are on each side of the earthworm. Okay, but their bristles are not as extensive because they're moving through a different medium than we see in some of the other groups. All right, and another famous member of this group, the leeches. So these leeches are going to be hematophagous, which means that they are blood eaters. So about 3/4 of this group are going to be blood eaters, hematophagous, but the rest of them are predators. Okay, they are ectoparasites of snails, of turtles, of vertebrates, of humans, each species has its own preferred host that they like to grasp onto. And then once they grasp onto it, their anterior region has a sucker. And in the inside of that anterior region, you have a 3-point blade, 3-sided blade right here that they use to scissor into the flesh. So that 3-point blade is inside of a sucker. So they literally attach themselves, sucker themselves onto the skin of whatever they're going to be eating, and then use that blade to cut in through the flesh, and then they suck up the blood. And then they also have a sucker on the posterior end as well. So typically when a leech is attached to its host, both the anterior and posterior regions will be attached to their host to prevent them accidentally falling off. They do secrete an anticoagulant that we call hirudinea from their mouth, so that way as they're feeding, the blood doesn't clot. Those platelets don't cause a clotting, and so they can keep feeding until they've had their entire blood meal. Typically the parasites that are found in leeches aren't able to survive in humans, but viruses and other bacteria at times can survive in the leech and then be spread from host to host as the leech moves from host to host. So they are known to sometimes spread pathogens in that way. These leeches tend to be dorso-ventrally flattened, so whereas an earthworm is very cylindrical, leeches tend to be dorso-ventrally flattened. Okay, they have a very unique history of medicinal uses. For a long time in medieval times, up till even like the 1700s, maybe even the 1800s still, people would bloodlet using leeches to cure any number of ailments. If you had a headache, if you had hemophilia, they would upset stomach. It really varied, and there was no scientific evidence behind bloodletting using leeches to remove blood to cure any disease. And so usually these leeches bloodletting had a negative impact on the patient and made the condition worse. But today they're having a resurgence They are being used a lot of times to reduce inflammation, to reduce swelling sometimes, or in limb reattachment or in digit reattachment. So let's say I go to the ER because I accidentally cut off my thumb, right? I was chopping vegetables very vigorously or something. But I get there soon enough that they can reattach it, okay? So if they reattach my thumb, old blood might start to pool in my thumb, right? And that's not good. We want some fresh blood carrying lots of oxygen to come in and nutrients, and so that way that blood can come in, and we want to remove that old blood, right? But if my arteries, if my capillaries aren't connected yet, how do we get that old blood out of there, and how do we draw in fresh blood? Well, there are some surgeons that are using attaching a leech to that digit, to that limb, to remove that old blood, and then that draws up fresh blood. Okay, so they are being used in some ways in medicinal purposes, but they're not just randomly caught in the environment. They're grown in labs and they're sterile, basically, so that way they're safe to use. So anyway, so that's the leeches, and that's Phylum Annelida, and so I will see you soon for our next phylum.